Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. And today's video, we're going to be starting our alternative history series. Before we do any of that, we have to really start to think, why is alternative history important? Now, I know there's a lot of historians who will argue, and my dad as well, what's the point in alternative history? Yeah, it's all just sort of make-believe. Don't get me wrong, there's good alternative history and there's bad alternative history. So bad alternative history, like we said before on the channel, is if Hitler hadn't been born, then somehow we'd be like living on Mars or something, like, you know, it'd be just kind of ridiculous things. This channel, as much as possible, is going to try and look at good alternative history. So hopefully we're not going to like start straying too far away from things. We're not going to be like, on this date, this is going to happen, etc., etc., because realistically, one battle changing can have a butterfly effect as such. Like anyone who knows anything of like Back to the Future or etc., etc., you change a little tiny thing in the past and then it completely alters the course of history. With a lot of these things, it's going to have to be very broad, and it's going to have to kind of have a lot of caveats, and we're going to have to bear a lot of things in mind that actually this is not an exact thing of what we think will happen, but just generally the impact of certain things end up having this effect. Ipso facto, if that thing didn't happen, then we could expect a different course in more general terms. So that's going to be kind of the point of this. So with this first video, we're going to be looking at Operation Unthinkable. People already know about this. Feel free to skip forward a little bit, because if you know about it, then like I'm not going to be able to give as in-depth of an explanation as there are on other channels, yeah? However, the basic gist of it is this. Operation Unthinkable is a proposal made by Winston Churchill in 1945, in which he said that what the Allies should do at the end of World War II, straight after beating Nazi Germany, is to invade the Soviet Union. Now, the reason for that is because a lot of people forget when we're looking at the Cold War and World War II, etc., etc., is actually the Western powers had been very, very hostile to the Soviet Union up until June 22nd, 1941, with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany. Up until that point, the Soviet Union had always been the enemy of the West. You think all the way back to 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, the ensuing civil war where all the Western powers invaded to try and destroy like the Red Army. Churchill himself said, we need to strangle communism in its cradle. So that shows you like how they wanted to crush it as soon as it had any like inkling of being shown. And hostility throughout the 20s, throughout the 30s was still there. The United States didn't even recognize the Soviet Union as an official country until 1933. So that gives you a certain sense of just how hostile the Western powers were. So what's very, very strange in the grand scheme of things, especially when you think about what happened straight after the war with the Iron Curtain speech and etc., is what happened the day after Operation Barbarossa. Winston Churchill said that if Hitler himself had invaded hell, he would have at very least written the devil a nice speech, like kind of like to be presented in Parliament or something along those lines. So within the context of World War II, at that point, Britain had been on its own for almost a year. And you know, with the fall of France, there was very little hope that Britain alone could defeat the Nazi war machine, right? They were fighting in North Africa and they were winning some campaigns and losing others, etc., etc. It was a thing where while Britain might survive, that was still no guarantee. And certainly any idea of pushing the Nazis all the way back and destroying them completely was almost unthinkable at that point. So in terms of real politics, yeah, in terms of like looking at the reality on the ground and thinking, actually, this situation needs to be remedied, Churchill realised that Hitler invading the Soviet Union now had created an ally. The enemy of my enemy is now my friend. This also goes into Churchill's general thinking, which was that in international relations, there are no permanent alliances, only permanent interests. So Britain has permanent interests, which is that no country can dominate the continent of Europe, and that they need that kind of access to the open oceans, right? And anyone who threatens that global supply chain or threatens the balance of power on the continent needs to be opposed. This is why Britain goes to war in 1939, because Hitler is looking like he's gonna upend the balance of power in Europe and become far too strong. 1941, that's when they decide, actually, we're going to be allies with the Soviets. But what if that had gone differently? to talk about Operation Unthinkable, if we start it just at that point, which a lot of alternative histories do, I think that it misses out a lot of other things. I think that a better point of departure is on that date in June 1941, where instead of giving that speech, Churchill goes, okay, Hitler just invaded the Soviet Union. We don't like the Soviet Union, and we don't like Nazi Germany. So what we're going to do is we're going to not necessarily wage war against the Soviet Union, but we're going to continue our war against Nazi Germany. Soviets might be attacking them as well, but we're not going to give them any aid. We're not going to give them any support. We're not going to be sit around at tables, and like discuss things. We're going to run our war the way we see it, and they're going to run their war. And if it so happens that we end up meeting at some point, when we meet at some point, but we're not going to coordinate anything. So that's going to be the premise of this alternative history. So for those of you who think that this is a kind of unfeasible proposal, I'd like to draw your attention to the proposed Operation Pike in 1939. Just to give some context, Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1st, 1939. 16 days later, the Red Army invades Poland from the east. So if Britain and France went to war against Germany for invading Poland, one would expect, on that same principle, for Britain and France to then declare war on the Soviet Union for when they invade Poland. But for various different reasons, the Allies thought actually it's better to take on one enemy rather than two. And actually, strategically speaking, had they attacked both, it probably would have been even more disastrous. 1940 would have been even more disastrous than it was. But within Operation Pike, there's the idea of bombing the Caucasian oil fields. So this is where the Soviet Union got most of its oil from. And so there was a plan to go up from British-held Middle East and fly bombing campaigns to destroy those oil fields. Just to give you a bit of context in terms of hostilities between Britain and the Soviet Union were quite tense up until Operation Barbarossa. Anyway, moving forward now. So Operation Barbarossa has hit and the war on the Eastern Front is going ahead, etc., etc. I don't think that very much changes in terms of what happens in terms of the outcome in the end. The Soviet Union is still going to defeat the Wehrmacht. It's going to take slightly longer with two words: lend-lease. Britain and America gave lots and lots of supplies to the Soviet Union. And now it's debatable about how much of this aid actually contributed to the Soviet war effort. Some people are saying that they couldn't have won it without this lend-lease. Other people saying that they would have, but it would have taken slightly longer. I'd probably go with the latter. I think that the Soviet Union, just in terms of logistics, in terms of numbers, in terms of a whole bunch of different things, there was multiple reasons why the German army did not defeat the Soviets and couldn't have defeated the Soviets in the field for various different reasons. I think that given what happened, they still would have won on the Eastern Front, but it would have taken them significantly longer. On the flip side, it would have been a thing where the Allies would have had more resources in their hands. They wouldn't have sent people like my great uncle to do the Arctic convoys, which was sending supplies from Britain all the way up into the Russian Arctic port of Murmansk. So those sort of things, they wouldn't have wasted their time doing that, and so they would have more resources on the ground to actually focus on their campaigns. Most of what the Allies supplied the Soviets were things like food. Spam was a big thing. There's the argument that Soviet Union might not have been able to feed itself without all these food rations that came in. There was jeeps, which the Soviets didn't have in the same quantity or quality. Many of the tanks, although the Soviets, most of the tanks were for themselves, but in terms of especially light tanks came from the Western Allies as well. Also technology such as radar, such as decent radios, etc., etc. Lots of things which would have enhanced the Soviet war effort and which would have been less so if there hadn't been this kind of mutual support. With that in mind, we have to skip from 1941 to 1944 because I don't think that on the Eastern Front the situation changes that much. However, on the Western Front, it does change, especially in the Mediterranean campaign. What we have to realise is that the Western Allies throughout the war were basically saying, right, okay, our focus is on taking out Germany from the west, and also Churchill's big thing was taking out Italy from the south and going up through the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. However, if they had been hostile to the Soviet Union, they would have been a lot more aggressive, and they would have been a lot quicker to have actually put a lot of forces in, because they'd be racing with the Soviets to try and get Berlin first and to take as much territory as possible before the Red Army could take it. With that being said, you would have seen a lot more emphasis on the Italian campaign and the Greek campaign, because they would have sent a lot more troops to Greece in an effort to to liberate the Balkans from the Nazi sphere of influence before the Red Army can come through. You would have had a very different 1944, not to mention that on the Western Front, when they're coming up through Normandy after D-Day and stuff, they would have had a much more of a push to be fighting through Germany. Everything would have been right, we need to gain as much territory as possible before the Reds come in. The Soviet Union, in 1944, launched Operation Bagration. I think I pronounced it wrong. With that campaign, that's where they basically pushed from what's today probably best described as the Russian western border, all the way to pretty much the former boundaries of the Soviet Union pre-1940. And so they're able to kick the Red Army out of the Soviet Union at this point. And then they go on throughout the autumn and winter of 1944, through Romania, through Hungary, knocking out those two allies for the Axis, and also, very importantly, taking out the Iranian oil fields, which was the Axis' only real supply of oil. For them doing that, the days of the right were numbered. Yeah, they were then surrounded, they would be closed in, and it was only a matter of time before the Third Reich eventually fell. However, if there had been more of this kind of push up through the Balkans with regard to the Western Allies, they might have been able to reach Romania and the oil fields before the Soviets did. But that's down to a degree of speculation, because by that time there would have been more of an emphasis on the front in France. So that's a bit of speculation. The general thing we can work out is that there would be more emphasis, there would be more presence, there would be more territory in the Allies' hands in the Mediterranean and in the Balkans than there was in our timeline. Thinking now about how it'd been on the Western Front, when the two armies are finally closing in, rather than meeting on the Elbe River in the middle of Germany, I have no doubt that the American soldiers could have taken Berlin and met the Soviets at the Oder, which is the current day border between Germany and Poland, at very, very least. That's in 1945. If the Western powers have more resources, they're moving at a faster, more aggressive rate, and if the Soviets are at a weakened position, their troops are underfed, they don't have as good technology or logistical support, such as jeeps, etc. I think that they would have got there, but at a slower rate, and therefore their front line would have been much further back. So for instance, at the end of Operation Bagration, they end up getting to the Vistula, which is basically to the gates of Warsaw. So I think that they might have been able to, if they really focused on it, I think the Soviets might have been able to conquer Poland, present-day Slovakia, maybe a little bit of Hungary, etc., etc. But I doubt that they would have, in that same amount of time, been able to have really pushed through as far as they did in our timeline. So now we're at the point of spring of 1945. I can't say exactly when, but in our timeline, if the Soviets were able to conquer Berlin by late April, and Hitler ends up committing suicide on April the 30th. So I predict that, based on the fact that from early April to April the 25th, the Allies were able to advance from the Rhine River in the west all the way up to the Elbe River, which is where they meet the Soviets. If they were able to do that quickly in the space of about 3 weeks, I don't see why, if there had been a bigger, faster drive from an earlier stage, with more men, with more equipment, with more resources, with etc., etc., and a lot more emphasis, also combined with the Soviets being comparatively weaker, who would have lost more men, had less resources, etc., etc. I think that actually Berlin probably could have been taken, maybe, let's say, even as early as the end of March. It wouldn't have been by that much, but who knows? And it's also quite probable that, because this happened in our timeline, the Nazis surrendered a lot quicker to the Western Allies than they did to the Soviets, because they didn't want to be taken over by the communists. What we have to think of as well, when these two armies meet, it's very different than in our timeline. In our timeline, the two sides meet, and they swap uniforms with the soldiers swap uniforms, and they're drinking and they're partying, and they're all like it's all nice and friendly. It would have been very, very different in this time. These two armies, which up until this point had been very hostile to each other, would have met, and who knows what might have happened. There was already fears that there would have been like friendly fire in our timeline between like these two like kind of like armies. Let's say that army discipline and communication is good in this time, and the two armies don't just suddenly start clashing straight away. That wouldn't have been necessarily like kind of the best like thing for either side, strategically speaking. What we have to think of in broader terms now is this: if the two sides have not been allies throughout the war, you wouldn't have the Potsdam Agreement, which came later, but more importantly at this point you wouldn't have had the Yalta Conference of 1943, so there would have been no agreed upon war aims, like kind of like end goal of like what Europe's going to look like afterwards, etc., etc. There would have been no cohesion, and the UN, which would end up being set up in 1945, would have clearly excluded the Soviets. The Soviets already didn't want to join it. They had to have many sweeteners put in. The UN itself, like the fact that like you have the permanent Security Council, where five top like powers, all of which happened to be the victors after World War II. You know, so Britain, France, America, China, and Russia. That whole thing was set up by the Soviets because they said, well, if you have the UN, the non-communist powers are always going to be able to outvote the communist powers, and therefore we, the Soviet Union, want to basically have veto power. So the whole concept of having 200 countries in the world, and the fact that just one country within those five can veto it, and then it doesn't get agreed on. Yeah, that's down to Stalin. That's down to the Soviet Union. We have to imagine that like the international order being very, very different as well. The big disagreement at Yalta and later at Potsdam was about the fate of Poland. The Allies in our timeline pretty much said, okay, yeah, Poland we'll leave for another day. We've got like the Free Polish like army and stuff who fought bravely with us throughout the war, but we're just gonna just quiet, right? Like you're small potatoes in comparison to the Soviets. However, in this timeline, it would have been a situation where the voices of these Free Polish people would have been like upheld a lot more, especially with this added aggression and continued uninterrupted hostility towards the communists. Soviet troops in Poland would not have been like, it wouldn't have been a negotiable situation. It wouldn't have been something that allies would have just been like, okay, that's fine, but like kind of that's your prize for your contribution during the war. It would have been a thing of, no, we've just fought a war to stop someone being an aggressor and occupying a foreign country. You're now not going to do the same thing. Because of geography, because of the North European plain, which is relatively like flat like territory, so it's kind of a funnel, so Soviet troops can pour into Poland, type in the North European plain, just so you get a bit more of an understanding. I'm not going to like sit here and expect I'll be here for another 5 minutes trying to explain the geographical advantages of the Soviet position at that point. They would have taken most of Poland, but then the big argument would have been straight after the war, Soviet troops need to come out of Poland. The Soviets would have been like, no, you cheated us, you didn't help us, we're taking as much territory as we can. And also, obviously, the former Russian Empire did include a big chunk of Poland, so it would have been like, well, no, sorry, we're taking this for ourselves. And so I think if there was to be Operation Unthinkable, I think it would have been, at that point, the status of Poland would have been what the big fight was about. So based on all this, we can predict that given those circumstances, Operation Unthinkable would have become Operation Thinkable sometime in the summer of 1945. This would have been the best opportunity for the Allies to have struck east. What was the situation on the ground at the time? People at the time in the West poo-pooed the idea of Operation Unthinkable for various different reasons. The fact that Churchill was defeated in the 1945 general election and was replaced by Clement Attlee, which is a video we'll get onto next time. There's a lot of overlap with this, but it's also it's a video within itself, like that has many different like facets to it. So stay tuned for that. So Churchill was defeated. People at that time have just seen the Soviet Union raise their banner on like the Reichstag building in Berlin. For everyone around the world, they see it as the Soviet Union has won the war. If, however, it ends up being an American or British flag or UN flag, which is flown above the Reichstag, then a lot of it ends up being a thing where actually the narrative ends up being the Western Allies have won the war. So the Soviet Union, has wasted this manpower and and lost all these lives and etc. And on top of that, they don't even have the moral prestige of being the ones who won the war. People miscalculated because of this kind of fact, because this idea that had always been there of the Russian steamroller, the Russian juggernaut, powering its way through with like millions and millions of men. In reality, if you actually look at the actual figures rather than division numbers, because what you have to bear in mind is that while the Soviets had so many more divisions, in reality, Western allies, they had divisions which had many more men than Soviet divisions did. So on paper, you look like, oh, they've got more divisions, but in actual fact, they've got more. So when we look at the actual numbers, and compare them to each other, we find this. Worldwide, the Western allies had at very least 11 million troops. So if you include just Britain and just America. So never mind everyone else, that's 11 million troops. Soviet Union had 10 million troops worldwide in 1945. And when we look on the front lines in Europe, we find that when you combine all the different Western forces, you find that there's 6 million Western allies, and there's about 6 to 7 million Soviet troops in the east. This is the situation in 1945. While a lot of the studies beforehand projected it to be a thing where the Soviets outnumbered the Americans 2-1. In actual fact, it's a thing of actually there's a lot more parity. Plus, the Western allies would be better fed, better supplied, have better technology, etc., etc. Given that they'd be at the Oder River rather than at the Elbe, it'd be a lot easier of a position for them to go into. What about the actual equipment and stuff that they would have been using? The Western allies had 22,000 tanks, and the Soviets had about 30,000 tanks. Although obviously not all of them would have been there on the Western Front. Now if we look at planes, we find that the Western Allies had 28,000 planes versus 19,000 planes. So this is within the front lines in Europe. However, worldwide, the Americans had almost 30,000 planes either in America itself or on the Pacific Front. And this is something we have to bear in mind with regard to the Pacific Front still going on at this time. It would have been seen as actually the main focus throughout the whole of what we're talking about would have been the European front, because the Soviets, if Operation Unthinkable had happened, they would have been very unlikely to have started invading Manchuria and stuff in the Far East, because they would have been this is more important. The war in the Pacific would have just continued on as it had. It was inevitable that Japan was going to be defeated, and I don't see much in the way of this timeline changing, other than perhaps the Soviet Union doesn't invade Manchuria, and therefore the war in the Pacific drags on slightly more, because we theorized that the Japanese, it was a combination of the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki plus the entry of Soviets into the war that made Japan finally surrender. But anyway, that specific front put to the side for 1 second. Now if we're going to talk about the European front, they have many more planes that they have potentially available. And then when we look at navies, we find that the Western Allies had 28,000 battleships compared to just 8 for the Soviet Navy, and 28 carriers versus 0 carriers for the Soviets. Even if somehow the Soviet Union pushes the Western Allies all the way back to France, etc. Just in terms of planes, just in terms of navy and stuff, the Western Allies still have a formidable position. And actually, with this many tanks as well, and these are better tanks as well in many regards. Yes, the Soviets had stronger tanks in some regards and more power, but it would have been quite difficult for the Soviets to push them back. Even if it was the middle of Germany, it would have been quite difficult for them to push it back, let alone if it was from all the way in Poland and having to push them all the way to France, because that's a distance of about 1,000 miles. So that's quite considerable. But I'll tell you what else is considerable: the fact that I'm now wearing this. Trying out for this video, I'll see what the feedback is, whether people say it looks smarter than me just wearing jumpers or whatever. That suggests this, so I don't know, at the end of the day, it's not that deep. If I'm wearing this, you go, oh, it looks more presentable, then I'll be calm. If you're saying, oh, it doesn't really make much difference, or it just looks a bit dead, then I'll switch it up. But we'll see, who knows. I prefer to just wear casual things, but it is what it is, customer's always right. apart from the ones who are obviously wrong. But anyway, like, comment and subscribe to this, and also like share with your friends, and also really like hit the like button, because I'm noticing there's quite a lot of haters to my videos, and so what you have to do if you're watching this and you're already signed into your YouTube account, hit the like button, dab on the haters, because too many people are coming through and they're just being like, dislike, and you're not even giving me comments as to why you're disliking, which is more frustrating, because how am I supposed to know how to improve if you just do a dislike? Like, that's just lazy. Like, kind of the hell, like, kind of put, like, if you're gonna talk here, talk with full chest, innit? So anyway, so back to the video. So now I'm gonna focus on the campaign itself. Now, it very much depends on what the war aims are for the Allies. If the war aim is to march all the way to Moscow and overthrow Stalin and liberate, like, from the Soviet Union from communism, and a very long protracted war, that might have been possible. However, the costs of that would have been immeasurable. The Soviet Union obviously had been devastated throughout World War II. Like, they had lost like 27 million people. Like, how much longer their economy, how much longer their population could put up with so many deaths and destruction and stuff. It's feasible that the Soviet Union might have crumbled given a second mass invasion coming from the West so soon after the first. But at the same time, I think that the Western Allies wouldn't have attempted that, and I think that they would have been foolish to have attempted that. I think that also, in terms of morale, the Western Allies who had just come out from, like, for the British, it had been 6 years of war, and for the Americans, it had been 4 years of war. And while their casualties were nowhere near as bad as the Soviets, population back at home, given that both of those places are democracies, would have said, no, actually, we're not doing that. We're not invading the Soviet Union. Especially after it had been clear that Hitler had failed. So what makes us think that somehow we would succeed if, like, the Wehrmacht, which this has been like the largest invasion force of all time at this point, if they had failed against when invading the Soviet Union, what makes them think that the Western Allies might have succeeded? A much more feasible and a much more, like, legitimate war aim, if they had decided to have gone down that road, would have been pushing the Soviet Union back to the lines of pre-1939. They invaded East Poland, but they also invaded territory in Romania, and they took, like, what's modern day Moldova, and they took the Baltic states, right? So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. For them to have returned back to pre-1938 borders, I think that would have been a much more legitimate thing within the realms of, like, international relations. There would have been a much stronger argument to have pushed the Soviets back to their own borders and left their territory intact, while being able to say, well, we're liberating countries from being occupied by foreign powers. If that was the war aim, I think that quite easily could have been done. Not like easy, but I think like a war on that kind of, like, front, etc., that quickly, that was purely just up until this line and then no further, just hold at the former Soviet border, could have potentially been a war of attrition. And I think the Soviet Union at that point would have been like, well, we've tried our best to take as much as we could, and at the end of the day, we have our territory back. Like, it would have been very difficult to paint it as the capitalists are trying to conquer our land after, like, it would have been very difficult to paint them as, like, invading fascists, etc. And so I think that after a short amount of time, like, kind of like the Stalin would have just like called a truce and been like, okay, fine, like you guys win. And I think that could have been achieved relatively quickly. Maybe it might have taken a year at best, maybe 2 years. But, like, I think both sides, that there was war fatigue at this point. I think both sides would have been like, you know what, fine, okay, we can live with this. How would this have affected relationships in the post-war period? The Soviet Union would have felt betrayed, it would have felt embittered, it would have felt isolated. It would have been like, well, we've just been attacked, we've had, like, a huge amount, we've had 13% of our population killed, right? And if you think about countries such as Belarus in the war lost 25% of its population. So that's, like, it's significant. Like, we can't even like fathom it in terms of Britain, for instance, in the war lost about, I think, 1% of its population. So it doesn't even pale in comparison to, like, what the Soviets went through. Given that, I think that relationships between the West and East, which in our timeline were already tense because of the division, like, kind of like between East and West, like, kind of, you had the situation in Berlin, you had all these kind of tensions, you had the Iron Curtain, like, kind of like Korea, like, kind of like Red China, all these kind of things. The situation in the late 40s and early 50s were already tense enough for there to be a Cold War. I think that if after the Soviets had fought through all of that, and then you'd been like, no, actually, now you're not like kind of back to your borders and stuff. I think that the Soviet Union would have felt even more isolated from the rest of the world, and it would have turned in on themselves and become a very much of a kind of a xenophobic, kind of like insular, like kind of like very suspicious country, much as North Korea is today. And I think Stalin would have like tightened the grips on power even more. I think that rather than there being the triumph of like the Red Army, I think they would have had more purges. I think there would have been more distance. I think any kind of group which had even had an inkling of suspicion of like being supportive of the Nazis or of the West would have just been rounded up and executed. Even with Soviet POWs, who'd been captured by the Germans, Stalin still took them and sent them to Siberia, and for many years, because the suspicion of them being like Nazi collaborators, or at very least just being cowards, was already there. Even in a moment of total victory, you still had these kind of like retribution, like this kind of recrimination. So I think that if they'd gone through all of that and essentially lost the war, like from the Soviet perspective, I think it would have been even more recrimination in that sense. For the people who think that all of a sudden like the nuclear bombs would have been going off, to a certain extent, yes. So the Americans at this point had the Manhattan Project, and so they would have had the capability to have dropped bombs on the Soviet Union. And actually, if there was this Operation Unthinkable, nuclear weapons might have been used on a tactical basis to have like destroyed the Soviet army. Would they have had the capability to have struck all the way at Moscow? Probably not, maybe. But I think that nuclear weapons might have been used, although I don't think they would have necessarily needed to have been used. But certainly the Americans, especially in those times, being the ones who had it, and the whole reason why they created it was to be able to use it. All the stigma that we've had since then about the effects of nuclear weapons wasn't there in 1945. So I think they would have been much more inclined to have used it against the Soviets. In our timeline, the Soviets end up getting nuclear weapons in 1949. That's bearing in mind that they had Soviet spies inside the Manhattan Project who were feeding information back to the Soviets so then they could build their weapons program. I don't see how that happens so much in this timeline. Because there's this hostility throughout that time, there would have been extra suspicion. There would have been even more like red baiting during that time, so there would have been even more cracking down on anyone suspected of being a communist, suspected of being a double agent. So I think that even less information would have got through to the Soviets in that time. Well, in our timeline, you'd be like, well, okay, we're wartime allies and stuff. I think given the circumstances here, it would have been like, like we're not like cooperating with them at all. Someone like found in any part of that at any point would have just been like completely locked off. I think that the Soviet Union, through their own means, might have been able to get a nuclear like weapon some point in the 1950s. However, given like their limited like capability, and also in our timeline they took over like parts of Germany where they were able to get extra people like from the German rocket industry and extra like kind of technology, etc. I think that given this timeline where they are basically pushed straight back to their own borders, there would have been much less of that. Even though, like, just to bear in mind that most like Nazi scientists, like did go to the Americans anyway. Given all of that, I think it's very unlikely that the Soviet Union would have had nuclear weapons until, like I say, some point in the 1950s, and the point at which they would be able to deploy it in a mass scale would have probably been like maybe the mid-50s, maybe the late 50s. This timeline, I think, realistically has to stop here, because beyond this, it's quite difficult for me to really like pan out how the Cold War goes. All we can tell is that the Soviets would have been a lot more embittered, but then at the same time, they would have had less territory, they would have had less support globally, they wouldn't have had as much like popularity for communism, because at the end of the day, Western style liberal democracy and capitalism has won like in the war against the Nazis. And so the kind of moral thing of the Soviet Union, that communism defeated Nazism and fascism, it would have been a lot more difficult to have made that sort of argument. So I don't think that it would have had the same popular appeal around what's the Western allies and Europe in it as a whole is freer, is less divided. You might have had something like the EU and NATO come up like even beforehand. Gap between East and West wouldn't have been as great in terms of like economic productivity, and therefore you wouldn't see the gap, for instance, between West Germany and East Germany, which even to this day, East Germany is significantly poorer as a result of being communist. You wouldn't have had such a kind of like chasm between East and West, but you still would have obviously seen that between Europe as a whole, not including Russia, and then obviously just Russia, but more like the Soviet Union by itself, right? They would have been significantly poorer. In our timeline, they extracted a lot of resources and sent a lot of like kind of like weapons and money and stuff back from the conquered territories in the East, back to the Soviet Union to help like rebuild. If you didn't have all of this extra stuff to basically steal, it would have taken them longer to have rebuilt, and so the gap between the rest of Europe and the Soviet Union would have been like very stark. Not going to speculate too much on whether Stalin might have been overthrown, but again, it'd be a thing where the people of the Soviet Union, rather than seeing Stalin as being this mad hero, it would have been like, well, okay, you repelled the Nazi invasion, but at the same time, we're still exactly where we were before, and we've not really like achieved that much. We just lost a lot of people. We're still poorer, and you're still being repressive. There might have been an overthrow. Who knows? When Stalin dies in 1952, who knows where that goes? Because de-Stalinisation in our timeline, it already led to uprisings in Poland and in Hungary and many other places. In this timeline that we're like positing, I think that you might have had those similar kind of like uprisings in the Soviet Union itself, but we can't speculate when that might happen, how big that would happen. Would the Soviet Union itself collapse in the 1950s? It's just too much to say. And I'm not going to pretend to talk about something like how the world would be in 2020, because past about 1955, I can't, like, this timeline becomes like untenable, because it'd be such a like departure from the world that we actually went into, that I don't think anyone can really talk about it in any sort of sensible way. So with that being said, I'm going to leave that timeline there, and thank you, and I really hope that you enjoyed that video. Like I said, we're going to be focused on alternative history videos for like, well, until I run out of alternative history. I think it was like, off the top of my head, I think I've got at least a dozen. Probably will think about some more as well. So that should lead us up until probably the Christmas period. Also, stay tuned. I'm going to try my very, very best to get a compilation video of all of the funny clips, like all the bloopers that have come in all the different videos. But that's going to be a mammoth kind of task to do, and so hopefully I'm able to get that together, but there's no guarantee of that. If it does, then I plan to release that around Christmas time, possibly on my birthday, which is Christmas Eve. So that being said, have a great day, and bye.